Okay, so welcome to this session, which will be biology, part of lesson 1. We're doing chapter 2, but we're doing the second half of chapter 2, so sections 2.3 and 2.4. And this chapter is the chemistry of life. Actually, hold on one second. I gotta get down to that part of the lesson here. I started at the beginning. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we're doing the second half of chapter 2. You're going to see some practice questions here. If you're attending this webinar live, please answer the practice questions. They are not graded, they're just for practice. They help the teachers see what is working well, make sure you understand it. If there's something that students are all getting wrong while we go over this, we'll go back and review it. And for you, they kind of just help keep your mind going, help you to focus on the lesson and see if you're getting what you should be out of it. And just so you know, nobody can actually see your individual answers. We just get the percentages of the group's responses. So even if you don't think you have the right answer, please just answer, participate in the question, do the best you can, and nobody can see if you have the wrong answer. Okay, and do ask questions if you're here live. If you are on a computer or a laptop, you're going to see a speech bubble symbol. You click that to ask questions. And if you are on a phone or a tablet, you're going to see a little question mark icon. You click that and ask questions. So you can ask questions at any point. You won't be interrupting. And, we definitely want to hear from you. So we're going to jump into this. It's section 2.3 of chapter 2, which is the chemistry of life. In the previous video, we discussed atoms and chemical bonds and the properties of water that are important for life on Earth. And now we'll be looking at the section in the textbook called carbon compounds. We're so interested in compounds that contain carbon because that's what makes up most of the chemicals in the bodies of living things. Carbon atoms are ideal for this for 2 reasons. First, because they have 4 electrons available for bonding, so each atom of carbon can make 4 covalent bonds. Okay, so it gives it a lot of chance for it to interact with things. Second, the second reason they're important is they can bond not only with many different elements, they can also bond with other carbon atoms. So carbon can make long chains, or rings, or other complex structures. And then they have active groups of other molecules that attach to the carbon skeleton so that it can function. So this makes carbon sort of unique and very important, that it can make so many bonds, it can bond with itself, and it can bond with other things. So it makes an infinite amount of structures possible that are based around carbon. There are some carbon compounds that form and then attach together to form long chains. When this happens, the smaller units that join together are called monomers, and the chains of monomers linked together are called polymers. Thousands of monomers can attach together to form giant molecules called macromolecules. There are 4 types of macromolecules in living things: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we're going to look at all 4 of them, but the idea is that all of them have little units called monomers, and they join together lots and lots of them, thousands and thousands of them, into really big polymers, and they're so big that we call them macromolecules. So the first one is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are molecules made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're used for storing energy and for physically supporting organisms. Sugars, starches, and cellulose are all carbohydrates. Simple sugars are made of one single sugar molecule or two sugar molecules bound together. Okay, they're simple. It looks a bit complex. There's a lot going on there, but that's a simple sugar molecule. And they appear either singly, just one of those, or two of them hooked together. But complex carbohydrates form, okay, macromolecules form, where you have lots and lots of these simple sugars hooked together. Again, thousands of them stuck together in different formations. So glycogen is a macromolecule that animals use to store sugar for later. Starch does the same thing for plants, stores the sugar for later. And cellulose is a macromolecule in plant cells that makes them strong and rigid. So that's where the support comes in. The next one is lipids. Lipids are made mainly of carbon and hydrogen, and they do not dissolve in water. It's very important. Fats, oils, and waxes are all lipids, and they're used to store energy, create membranes, and make waterproof coverings for some tissues in the body. Oh, sorry. There we go. Store energy, create membranes, and make waterproof coverings. Many lipids are made of a glycerol molecule bound to chains of fatty acids. So when we talk about the fats that are in food, that's what it is. You've got glycerol bound to these big long chains of fatty acids. That's where the monomer and polymer thing comes in. You got these long chains of fatty acids. And the carbon molecules that are in those chains, they can have single bonds to each other. And each carbon in that case would have two hydrogens bonded to each carbon atom. When they're like this, they're called a saturated fat. If there are any double bonds between the carbon atoms, you get less hydrogen bonded to them. So you can see there's a missing hydrogen down here. When that happens, this is called an unsaturated fat. So usually saturated fats, like butter, are solids, and unsaturated fats, like cooking oils, are liquids. So just that slight change in the chemical composition, the compounds, the bonds between the carbon atoms, makes that difference. And the other type of macromolecule is called nucleic acids. The nucleic acids are the polymers, and they're made up of monomers called nucleotides. Each nucleotide has three parts: a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. So at this point, you don't really need to know what those parts are. We will learn about that in later chapters, but those are the three things that make up nucleotides. So this whole thing here, this is one monomer. That's one nucleotide. Now, there are some single nucleotides that exist, and they store energy. So there's one's called ATP, which you'll also learn about later a lot, and it just is in the cells as one single nucleotide. But you also get long chains of nucleotides that hook together, and they make up DNA and RNA, the giant macromolecules that store your genetic information. And the fourth type of macromolecule is proteins. Proteins are made of monomers called amino acids. Each amino acid has a carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen arranged in a certain pattern, and then has a group of molecules attached called an R group that helps it perform different functions. And each different amino acid has a different R group hooked to the bottom. The order in which the amino acids are chained together is the primary structure of the protein, but then those chains can fold and combine to make more complex levels of structure. So this one, for example, has a spiral shape, and then you could have ones with spirals or other shapes that can combine with other amino acids and make a really big, complex, complete protein. So that's everything from this section 3. So we're going to do a couple review questions before we go on. So this one is a poll. So I'm going to bring up a poll for you to answer. Again, if you're doing this live, you should answer the question. We can't see if you get the wrong answer. We just get the percentages of the whole class here. And if you're watching this later, just think about it and figure out what your answer is and see if you're right when we go over it. Okay, so those of you that are watching live, you should be clicking on your poll answers here. Question is, why is carbon so great? Your options: it can bond to other carbon atoms and lots of other molecules. It can only bond to other carbon atoms, and so it stays pure. Each carbon atom can make 2 covalent bonds. Each carbon atom is a monomer that makes up polymers. So I'll give you about another minute to think about it and give your answers. All right, so it looks like out of those of you that voted, most people got the right answer. And so let's go over what that is. So why is carbon so great? The right answer is this: it can bond to other carbon atoms and lots of other molecules. So remember, it can make big structures with a kind of skeleton of carbon and then have other things attached to it that help it do different functions. So our next answer, it can only bond to other carbon atoms. That's just not true. It can bond to other things. The third one here, each carbon atom can make 2 covalent bonds. That is not true. It can make 4. So it's another reason that it's really useful for building big structures of living things. It can make lots of bonds, 4 different bonds for each atom. And our last option, each carbon atom is a monomer that makes up polymers. That doesn't really apply. So when we talk about monomers and polymers, we're kind of talking about little molecules that link together in a repeated pattern to make big molecules. So a single carbon atom, even though a lot of them link together, it's not the same situation as monomers and polymers. Instead, the carbon is part of a bigger molecule. So there's carbon in simple sugars, and then those simple sugars can hook together and make a big molecule of starch or fiber. But definitely the first one, it can bond to other carbon atoms and to lots of other molecules. And we have one more review question. This one's not actually a poll because it's a matching type question, so there's no way to set that up. So just think about it. We're going to match the polymers to their monomers. So you have the polymers on the left, the real big molecules, and then on the right are monomers. They're the shorter, smaller molecules that make them up. So I'll just give you about 30 seconds to think about which ones go with which, and then we'll review the correct answers. Okay, so our polymers and monomers. On the left, we have nucleic acids. Okay, so that's DNA and RNA, and they're made up of the smaller units called nucleotides. The next one is proteins. Proteins are made up of units called amino acids. We have lipids, which are made of fatty acids. Oh, that went out of order, but oh well. Carbohydrates are made of simple sugars. Lipids are made of fatty acids. So it's important to know which molecules, which monomers make up the big polymers. And remember the name for these 4 specific polymers, because they're so huge, those are all called macromolecules. Okay, so let's go on to the last section of the chapter, which is section 4. Okay, so as we learned in section 1 of this chapter, there are only 92 elements found in nature, but they can combine together in millions of different ways to make chemical compounds, making all of the different chemicals that exist. A chemical reaction alters those chemicals by changing which atoms are bonded together. Constant chemical reactions in your body allow you to remain alive. Now, all chemical reactions either use up energy or release energy. Some reactions constantly take in energy, so they need a constant source of energy to happen. There's some reactions that happen on their own and then release energy. But there are also many reactions that have to use some energy to get started, but then they release much more energy than they use up. An example that you would be familiar with would be burning. Okay, catching something on fire and burning it is a chemical reaction. So paper doesn't light on fire on its own. You first need a source of energy, such as striking a match, to get it started. But once that reaction is started, the fire can release much more energy than what was used to light it. The amount of energy needed to get a reaction started is called activation energy. So activation energy is what's required to get a chemical reaction started. Even if that reaction later releases a lot more energy, it still just needs some to get started. It needs that activation energy. And this can be a problem for living things. You might not have enough energy available to get a reaction started, or there might be enough for the reaction to happen very, very slowly. But in living organisms, chemical reactions need to happen really quickly. So fortunately, there are substances called catalysts that reduce the amount of activation energy needed to start a reaction. Specifically, there are proteins called enzymes that act as catalysts in living things. If a cell needs a reaction to happen and to happen quickly, enzymes will be sent out to lower the activation energy needed for that reaction. So this graph shows an example of the activation energy needed to start a reaction. So this red line, the tall one, this would be how much energy would be needed to start the reaction without a catalyst. And the blue line here would show that you need much less energy to get that reaction started if there is an enzyme there acting as a catalyst. So enzymes are really important to living things because they mean that the reaction is much more likely to happen because it needs so much less energy to get started compared to what it needs without the enzyme. So a little more about enzymes. Each enzyme can affect a certain chemical reaction. And they do this because they are a specific shape to hold a specific molecule, which is called a substrate. The enzyme has an area called the active site that holds the substrate molecules. So you can see in this example, here's your active site. The substrate fits perfectly into the active site, and then it does its work. In this case, its whole job was just to break them apart. But if a different molecule is nearby, the enzyme won't be able to affect it because it just doesn't fit. So it can't do that work on a completely different molecule. Also, if anything such as changes in temperature or pH in the environment of the enzyme changes, it's going to actually change the shape of the enzyme so it wouldn't be able to hold its substrate correctly. So enzymes need to work at a certain temperature, a certain acidity level. If any of that changes, then the enzyme's useless. It gets messed up. And that is actually the end of section 4. So we have 2 more review questions. So here's one about energy and chemical reactions. So I'll give you about a minute to think about this one, which is true about energy and chemical reactions. Do chemical reactions always release energy? Chemical reactions never form new bonds. Chemical reactions are always slow. Chemical reactions might need a source of energy to get started. Only one of those is true. You think about it and then answer, and then we'll go over the correct answer. Okay, so we look kind of split here. So I'm glad that we did this poll so that we can go over what the right answer is. So a lot of people said this first one, chemical reactions always release energy. That is actually not true. They sometimes release energy. So actually, I'll just go back to that slide. I know it was real quick, but I showed this little animation here where sometimes the reactions have to use energy in order to happen. So those 2 molecules would have stayed together forever, but that energy had to come in and release them. Then there's other ones that are storing energy, and then they can just kind of release it on their own when they react. Back to the Okay, so sometimes they soak up energy, sometimes they release energy, sometimes they like soak up a little energy and then release a lot of energy. So they're all a little bit different, but what we can say for sure is energy is always involved. It's always either released or used up. How about our next one? Chemical reactions never form new bonds. So it looks like nobody picked that one, so that's good. Chemical reactions are all about making and breaking bonds. So I put usually because occasionally you get chemical reactions where something just breaks apart and it doesn't actually form a new bond, but usually there's a new bond formed somewhere. How about the third one? Nobody said that either. Chemical reactions are always slow. Well, the speed of chemical reactions can vary. The same reaction can happen really slowly or it can happen really quickly. And our fourth one is actually the right answer, so a lot of you picked that one. Great job. Chemical reactions might need a source of energy to get started. So this sort of relates back to this idea that they're all different. Some of them can happen spontaneously, which means they're storing energy and then they don't need anything to happen to get started. They just release the energy. But most chemical reactions do actually need some source of energy to at least get started, even if they end up releasing energy later. Okay, so good job there. And our last review question is, what do enzymes do? Okay, so again, we'll give you about a minute to answer. Do enzymes lower activation energy to slow down chemical reactions, lower activation energy to speed up chemical reactions? Do they bind to any type of substrate they can find, or do they work efficiently in any conditions? Only one of those is true. What do we think it is? There's a typo here. This should be they. Okay, so we got mixed answers here, so I'm going to go back to this slide about enzymes. Well, the two slides about enzymes. So first of all, um, activation energy, again, is the energy that's required to get a reaction started. And there's things called catalysts, which is anything that reduces the amount of energy needed to start the reaction. And enzymes are catalysts in living things. They're made of proteins. So the enzyme's job is to lower the activation energy. So again, without the enzyme, this is how much energy the reaction needs to take in. Okay, this is the amount of energy it has to use up to get started. And then with the enzyme, it lowers it. So that means that less energy has to be used up for the reaction to actually start. So when you think about that, it's costing less for the reaction to happen. So it's going to happen faster. So lowering the activation energy speeds up the chemical reaction. And the next slide about enzymes was about these other things, so the shape and the conditions. So remember, it's a very specific shape that's meant to fit a very specific molecule. And whatever molecule it works on is called its substrate. And if we try to put any old substrate in there that's a completely different shape, it's just not going to fit. So you have, in the body, there's lots and lots of different enzymes because each one is supposed to work on a very certain specific molecule. You can't just have one enzyme work on a lot of different things, very specific shape. And the last part about enzymes that we learned was that the temperature and the pH and some other conditions, but those are the important ones, have to be within a certain range. If the temperature gets too hot, the enzymes are ruined. They can't do work. If the pH is too high or too low, so if it's in water that's too acidic or something like that, that's going to change the shape of the enzyme and it won't be able to work. So let's go back to this review slide. What do enzymes do? Our first two, lower activation energy, but what does that do? Well, it does not slow down the reactions, it speeds it up. So this is the actual correct answer, lower activation energy to speed up the reactions. The third option, bind to any type of substrate they can find, is not correct. They can only bind to one type of substrate. Each enzyme is very specific and individual. And our last option, work efficiently in any conditions, no way. They have to work in specific conditions. So certain temperatures, certain acidity, certain everything else. Oh no. And I just realized the poll was still open, so I didn't know if you could see me go back and review everything. So, well, here I go again. Um, we were looking at the activation energy. So again, without the enzyme, lots of activation energy, lots of energy to use up. With the enzyme, you have to use up much less energy, so the reaction happens faster. And we looked at this slide. Each enzyme is a specific shape, and if you put a substrate in there that's a different shape, it's just not going to work. It has to be this certain molecule made for that enzyme. At the bottom of it, we talked about temperature and pH. They have to be in the right range. So they're the right answers. So sorry about that. I think the question was blocking the screen, so you couldn't see when I went over that. So I apologize. But there you go. So it speeds up the chemical reactions because it lowers activation energy. Enzymes can only bind to one type of substrate, and enzymes work efficiently only in certain conditions. All right, and that is the end of section 4. So for those of you watching this recording, if you do have any questions, you can email or call the instructors. This is how you do that. And for those of you that are here live, I'm going to stick around for a little bit and you can ask questions. So if you want me to go back over anything, absolutely ask me to. If you have other questions about this section, anything on this lesson, definitely ask. This is your time to do that.